Continuing with our Entity Framework core, we'll talk now about related tables. Let's just take a simple example of related tables. We have banks. We have only two banks, ANZ and RBS, and they have many customers. For example, the ANZ bank will have two customers, Ed and Joe, and the RBS would have one customer, which is called L, who is called L. So this is what the basic table would look like, where we'd have our banks here with a bank ID and a bank name, two banks here, and then we have three customers, Ed, Joe and L, and we need to relate those two. Well, the trick really is to place a bank ID in the many table, which is the customers. So within the customers table we would have a reference back, if you like, to the bank, indicating which bank they belong to. So Ed, he belongs to ANZ, and Joe belongs to ANZ, but L belongs to the RBS. So the way to do that is to introduce this bank ID within this particular table. So we've got our bank ID in the customers table. It's a bit tricky to get your head around this sometimes, so you need to think really carefully about which is the one table and which is the many. Now in this table, the banks table is the one side, and the customers is the many side. So you can see here that the ANZ with the bank ID of 1 has got the two customers, Ed and Joe, and the RBS with bank ID 2 has got only one customer, as it happens. We're saying in this case that the customers cannot have more than one bank, which is not very practical, but we can just put that stipulation in, because, I mean, for example, if Ed could actually belong to the ANZ and the RBS, but we're going to say that he can't. And if he were to, that's what we call a many-to-many relation, and we can talk about that later. So let's go ahead and make a new project. We'll just say we'll start a new project, a new console application, and we'll call it, as we make a console application as we normally do, and we'll call it TR Bank, for example, and then create our project. And then from NuGet we add these two libraries, the Entity Framework library. This is the one which enables us to join to our particular server, and then this is the general Entity Framework tools that we will be using. And then, as usual, we can add classes. We can project and add a class. That's probably the best way to do it there. It's a bit shorter. And then name our two classes. We've named them bank is one, and that's just simple. We have a bank ID and a bank name. It's very straightforward. But the customers, that's the one side, by the way. But the customers code. Notice that we've got the customer ID, of course, and then we've got the name of the customer, of course. But now we put in here a foreign key that refers back to the bank. But not only that, we have this is for, shall we say, standard procedure for making a database. But here we introduce the Entity Framework concept of how we relate the two tables. So yes, the bank ID is the foreign key inside the customers table, along with that's, as I say, now that's correct. Now that's standard procedure for making database related, but in this case we're instructing Entity Framework to relate the two tables by means of a bank type relating them. And by the way, it's probably a good idea to run the code actually, just to make sure that there are no glaring errors before we do the actual update. So we can do the update by we can add a migration, and as we say, we can call that what you like, followed by an update database to actually produce the database. So let's take a look at what we've produced. In my context file, the name of the database was database test. So let me try and go to Server Explorer and find that database, Server Object Explorer. From Server Object Explorer, we may need to refresh our database and go looking for the particular database. Let's take a look here, databases, and there it is there, database test. And we can take a look at the tables of the database test, and there's our banks and there's our customers. Let's take a look at the data, and you will recall that if we go to view the data, then we should be able to see that. And also with the customers, we can view the data there, and there's no data in it at the moment, so let's just go ahead and do that. We can put the customers. Let's start with the customers first of all. Actually, let's do the bank, and so we've got two banks, which was the ANZ and the RBS, and then we can take a look at the customers and add the customers as well to the table. So Ed belongs to bank 1, which is the ANZ. Then Joe also belongs to bank 1, but L, he belonged to the second bank, which was the RBS. So in summary, we've produced these two tables which are joined by means of the bank ID. Actually, these are the two tables. We've got the bank here, and this is the way that they're related by means of that bank ID. It may be worth looking at the migrations which have been added to our project. Now remember, the migrations is the code that is used to produce our database, which is automatically produced whenever we do our add migrations and also the update database. It produces and runs this particular code in here, which is the migrations which have been automatically constructed. So this being the latest one here, we can take a look at the latest migration code. In particular, the code that produces the foreign key. For example, in our customers table, we had a bank ID which became our foreign key, and also we'll come back to this later, but it's talking about making a cascade, referential action cascade, whatever that means. What it does mean, it means about a cascade delete. In other words, if you delete a customer, if you delete a bank, then it would delete all the customers as well. But we'll talk about that in another video, and in the next video we'll talk about querying the database as well as talking about that cascade delete.